I stood motionless inside the mahogany-paneled office of my father at the heart of downtown Chicago while staring at the cold legal document spread across the desk. My name is Heidi Miller, a 29-year-old financial risk analyst who spent years securing the very wealth that my family was now trying to strip away from me. My sister Belinda leaned over the desk with a sharp smirk as she pushed a gold fountain pen toward my hand and demanded that I sign away my entire inheritance because my father supposedly thought I was too unstable to manage it. She leaned closer to whisper a chilling threat into my ear, claiming she would personally ensure I was thrown onto the streets before the sun set if I dared to refuse her demand. My father, Milton, remained perfectly silent behind his massive desk while keeping his eyes fixed on a stack of unrelated files, as if my existence had already been erased from his life. The tension reached its breaking point when I realized this betrayal was not a sudden impulse, but a calculated scheme they had been refining for months to remove me from the family legacy entirely. I did not offer a single word of protest or shed a tear, because I simply reached down to grasp the pen and signed my name with a steady hand that left both of them in a state of confused silence. They thought they were watching me sign my downfall, but they failed to realize that this specific signature was the hidden trigger for a trap that would soon bring their entire world crashing down. If you are curious about the devastating trap hidden behind that single signature, please hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell notification to follow every twist of this intense journey right now. I left the Miller estate that very night with a single suitcase without leaving any parting words, because there was nothing left to say to people who saw me as a liability. The cold Chicago wind bit through my coat as I walked toward the gate while knowing that my departure was exactly what Belinda had spent months praying for. For too many years, my father had consistently covered up the reckless spending habits of Belinda, while shifting every ounce of administrative blame onto my shoulders to maintain the family's public image. I distinctly remembered an incident from not long ago when she withdrew millions of dollars from the maintenance fund of Miller Motors to fuel her extravagant lifestyle. Instead of holding her accountable for the missing capital, Dad chose to humiliate me in front of the entire board by calling me incompetent for failing to prevent the loss. That public shaming should have broken me, but instead it served as the final catalyst for me to utilize my professional skills as a financial risk analyst to quietly gather the truth. I spent months working late into the night at my small apartment to compile a secret database of the actual financial records belonging to our family business. Belinda had no idea that the golden child position she currently held was merely a fragile cover for the massive personal debts she had accumulated through bad investments. She believed that her manipulation of our father was a sign of her brilliance, but I saw it as a desperate attempt to hide the fact that she was drowning in financial ruin. Every time she mocked my supposed instability, I was actually observing the subtle patterns of her fraud and documenting the trail of digital breadcrumbs she left behind. I began reaching out to long-term business partners who had worked with Miller Motors for decades to confirm the specific fraudulent activities Belinda had executed under the name of Dad. These men were loyal to the company, but they were tired of the erratic demands coming from someone who didn't understand the mechanics of a dealership. The coldness I received from the Miller family over the last decade had forged a steel-like resolve within me that made me perfectly prepared for this final confrontation. I realized that my father's blind favoritism had made him vulnerable because he no longer bothered to verify the documents his favorite daughter placed on his desk for signature. While they were busy celebrating my official removal from the inheritance, I was securing the final pieces of evidence that would expose the structural rot within our empire. I sat in my new office downtown while staring at the screen of my laptop as the connections between Belinda's secret accounts and the company's missing assets became undeniable. It was almost tragic to see how easily she had exploited our father's trust, while he was too blinded by his own pride to realize his legacy was being dismantled piece by piece. My research revealed that several of our flagship showrooms in the Chicago suburbs were actually facing foreclosure due to the mismanagement of funds that Belinda had authorized. I knew that the signature I provided earlier that evening was the only thing standing between them and a total collapse of their perceived power. Every hour spent analyzing these spreadsheets felt like a step closer to the justice I had been denied since the day my mother passed away. The strategy was simple because I needed them to believe I was defeated, so they would continue their reckless expansion without fearing any internal oversight or professional interference. I watched from a distance as the legal team processed the documents I had signed, while knowing that my compliance was the ultimate bait for their impending disaster. Belinda likely thought I was hiding in some cheap motel room crying over my lost fortune, but I was actually refining the legal trap that would ensure she never held a pen in that office again. The steel in my heart didn't come from a desire for money, but from the necessity of stopping the destruction of what my grandfather had built with his bare hands. I closed my laptop with a sense of grim satisfaction, while realizing that the Miller name would soon be associated with a scandal that no amount of wealth could ever cover up. 2 years ago, I had a secret meeting with my grandfather Grover at a quiet estate located on the outskirts of Chicago to discuss the future of our family legacy. Grandpa Grover was the original founder of Miller Motors, who had spent his entire life building the reputation that my father and sister were now slowly destroying. He had seen through the greedy heart of Belinda and the weak-willed nature of Dad long before I ever realized the extent of their internal betrayal. During that afternoon, he handed me a faded copy of my grandmother Eleanor's original will, which contained a very specific protective clause regarding our inheritance. This legal provision stated that all family assets would be immediately frozen if any evidence of coercion or mental duress was discovered during a signing event. Grandpa Grover looked me in the eyes with a sense of clarity that my father had lost years ago because he knew I was the only one capable of saving the business. Heidi, you must remember that the most powerful enemies always reveal themselves when they think they have finally won the entire battle, Grandpa Grover said, while placing his hand over the legal documents. I felt a surge of confidence for the first time in years as I looked at the man who had taught me everything about integrity and financial discipline. I will do exactly as you instructed, Grandpa, and I will let them destroy themselves with the very trap they are trying to set for me, I replied with a steady voice that surprised both of us. This secret alliance became the only reason I was able to endure the constant humiliation and verbal abuse coming from Dad at the office every single day. Grandpa Grover began teaching me how to analyze complex financial reports that were hidden behind the simplified versions Belinda presented to the board of directors. I soon discovered that Belinda was secretly plotting to sell off several of our most profitable dealerships to a rival corporation for a fraction of their actual market value. She was desperate to liquidate the family assets because she needed quick cash to cover up the massive investment failures she had hidden in offshore accounts. My grandfather watched from his quiet estate as I spent my weekends learning the intricate details of corporate law and the specific mechanics of our dealership network. He reminded me that playing the role of the defeated victim was the most effective way to ensure that our enemies remained arrogant and careless in their movements. The absolute trust that Grandpa Grover placed in me became the primary fuel for my resilience during the long months of being ignored by my own father. I watched as Belinda grew more confident in her manipulation of Dad, while she convinced him that I was a threat to the family's stability and public reputation. While they were busy planning my eventual removal from the company, I was working with my grandfather to set up a series of digital triggers within the accounting software. These triggers were designed to capture every unauthorized transaction and forged signature that Belinda would inevitably produce as she grew bolder with her theft. We spent hours discussing the potential reactions of the board members and how to handle the inevitable fallout once the truth finally came to the surface. This period of secret preparation allowed me to build a steel-like emotional barrier that protected me from the daily insults I faced inside the Miller headquarters. Grandpa Grover insisted that I never reveal our connection to anyone, not even to the loyal employees who often wondered why I stayed in such a toxic environment. I understood that the success of our plan depended entirely on my ability to remain invisible and underestimated by everyone around me. Every spreadsheet I analyzed and every secret recording I filed away brought us closer to the day when the legal trap would be fully activated. I realized that my father had forgotten the most important lesson his own father had taught him about the necessity of verifying every piece of information. By the end of our meetings, I felt as though I was no longer the frightened daughter seeking approval, but a professional operator ready to defend her true legacy. Grandpa Grover provided me with the contact information for several high-level investigators who could help me verify the trail of money Belinda was moving through the company. I left the quiet estate that day with a profound sense of purpose because I knew that the signature Belinda would eventually demand from me would be her own downfall. The peace I found in my grandfather's wisdom gave me the strength to return to Chicago and face the arrogance of my family with a calm and calculating mind. I knew that the clock was already ticking on their reign of deception, and that justice was only a matter of time and careful execution. 6 weeks before the crucial board of directors meeting was scheduled to take place, I sought out my best friend Marshall at his high-security office. Marshall was an elite data security expert who possessed the technical skills necessary to bypass the sophisticated encryption layers Belinda used to hide her tracks. He spent several days scanning through thousands of digital transaction logs to identify the offshore accounts where she had been siphoning the company's operational capital. During our deep dive into the system, we discovered a series of predatory loans that Belinda had secretly taken out by putting up our flagship dealerships as collateral. Marshall managed to trace a hidden link between those loans and a private shell company that was registered under a pseudonym she frequently used. This discovery provided the hard evidence we needed to prove that she was intentionally sabotaging the family business for her own financial gain. Heidi, all of this evidence is enough to send her to prison for organized fraud immediately without any chance of a legal defense, Marshall affirmed while showing me the final report on his monitor. I felt a massive weight lift from my shoulders as I realized that the digital trail she left behind was far more extensive than I had initially imagined. Don't worry, I will be your legal representative during the board meeting to ensure that no one can interfere with the presentation of these facts, my fiancé Clayton said, as he entered the room to join our discussion. Clayton was a brilliant inheritance lawyer who had already spent weeks drafting the necessary documents to protect my interests in the upcoming confrontation. He had successfully completed the legal paperwork for us to quietly register our marriage at the Chicago City Hall just a few days prior. The decision to marry Clayton was driven by our genuine love, but it also served as a strategic move to combine our voting power under the Illinois marital property laws. This union meant that Belinda could no longer rely on the corporate bylaws to exclude me from the most important decision-making processes of the firm. Clayton reviewed the document I had signed in the first office confrontation and confirmed it would actually serve as a primary piece of evidence against Belinda. He explained that the specific wording of the contract combined with the presence of Grandpa Grover's protective clause turned the document into a legal confession of coercion. We spent every single night together at my apartment meticulously reviewing every possible loophole in the original will left by my grandmother, Eleanor. Our goal was to ensure that our counterattack was completely flawless and that every single allegation was backed by at least 3 different forms of verifiable proof. I took several days off from my regular duties to focus entirely on the final preparations for the board meeting while maintaining a low profile to avoid raising any suspicion. Belinda remained completely unaware of my activities as she continued to celebrate her supposed victory over my inheritance rights in the presence of our father. I watched from the shadows as she pressured Dad into signing more administrative papers that gave her even more control over the daily operations of the dealership network. Clayton and I worked closely with a team of private investigators to confirm that several of the board members were also being manipulated by Belinda's false promises. We knew that our success depended on surprising the entire room with the truth before anyone had the chance to destroy the digital evidence. Every hour of preparation brought us closer to the moment of truth, where the structural rot within Miller Motors would finally be exposed to the public. The intensity of our research often kept us awake until dawn, as we cross-referenced the bank statements with the internal inventory reports of the car dealerships. We found that Belinda had been falsifying the sales numbers to inflate the company's valuation, while she was simultaneously selling off the most valuable real estate assets. Marshall worked tirelessly to secure our communication channels so that none of our findings would leak back to the Miller family before the appointed time. Clayton drafted a formal petition for a forensic audit, which was designed to be served to the board the moment the meeting officially commenced. I felt a strange sense of calm as the final pieces of our strategy began to lock into place like a complex puzzle. I realized that my father's arrogance had created a blind spot so large that he could no longer see the betrayal happening right under his nose. By the end of the 6th week, we had compiled a comprehensive legal dossier that was heavy enough to destroy the reputation of anyone mentioned in its pages. Clayton reminded me that the law was firmly on our side as long as we remained disciplined and did not allow our emotions to dictate our actions during the presentation. I prepared myself for the inevitable anger and denial that would come from Dad when he realized his favorite child was a common criminal. The support from Marshall and the unwavering loyalty of Clayton gave me the strength to face the upcoming battle with total confidence. We were no longer just reacting to Belinda's movements because we had taken full control of the narrative and were now directing the flow of the entire investigation. I closed the final file on the night before the meeting with a clear understanding that the Miller legacy was about to undergo a radical and painful transformation. 1 week after successfully obtaining my signature on the transfer documents, Belinda organized a lavish party at the Peninsula Hotel to celebrate her newly acquired power. I watched from the shadows of the mezzanine as Dad stood on the grand stage with a look of immense pride while publicly announcing that I had been officially stripped of all rights and was no longer associated with Miller Motors. The room was filled with the elite of Chicago society, who clapped politely while whispering about the sudden downfall of the daughter who had once been the backbone of the company's financial operations. Belinda's arrogance reached its absolute peak as she began circulating among the guests, while bragging about her plans to sell off several valuable family assets to generate quick cash for her personal debts. She did not realize that every guest she approached was being monitored by the silent observers I had placed throughout the ballroom to document her indiscretions. "Look at our dear little sister, she has disappeared like a mouse after finally realizing that she has absolutely nothing left to her name." Belinda laughed loudly while raising a crystal glass toward a group of her socialite friends. I felt a cold sense of detachment as I observed her making the biggest mistake of her life by signing a short sell stock agreement that Clayton had carefully planted through a third-party broker. This specific contract was designed to look like a lucrative exit strategy, but it actually contained hidden clauses that triggered a mandatory forensic audit of her personal and corporate holdings. "You should enjoy that glass of wine right now because this will be the very last party you will ever attend as a lady of society," I thought to myself while adjusting my coat and preparing to leave the venue before I was spotted. The major shareholders of Miller Motors began feeling a deep sense of unease regarding the sudden instability and started calling Dad repeatedly to demand an explanation for the radical shift in management. However, Milton had been completely manipulated by Belinda's false promises of doubling the company's valuation through her new aggressive expansion tactics. He refused to take the calls from his oldest partners while preferring to bask in the temporary glory of being the father of the most powerful woman in the Chicago automotive industry. While they were busy celebrating their perceived victory, I was secretly submitting a massive file of evidence to the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding the unauthorized movement of funds. The high society circles of the city began to buzz with rumors about my mysterious disappearance, while wondering if I had fled the country in shame or was preparing for a legal battle. Clayton and I remained in constant communication through encrypted channels to ensure that every step of our plan was executed with military precision. He confirmed that the short sale agreement Belinda signed at the party was now legally binding and would force her to reveal the true state of the company's finances within 48 hours. We watched the market reactions closely as the first signs of doubt began to affect the stock price of our family's empire. I felt no guilt for the impending collapse because I knew that the rot within the organization had been caused by their own greed and lack of integrity. Every hour that passed brought us closer to the final board meeting where the truth would be unveiled in front of the very people they were currently trying to impress. The documents I filed with the authorities were meticulously organized to show a clear pattern of criminal behavior that had been happening under Dad's leadership for years. I realized that my father's legacy was being dismantled not by my actions, but by his own refusal to see the criminal nature of the daughter he favored. Belinda continued to spend money as if the fountain would never run dry, while failing to realize that her bank accounts were already being flagged for suspicious activity by the federal investigators. I spent the remainder of the evening at a small cafe across the street from the hotel, while watching the lights of the party fade into the night. The silence of my current life was a stark contrast to the hollow noise of the celebration I had just witnessed. I knew that when the sun rose the following morning, the world they had built on lies would finally start to crumble under its own weight. Exactly at 9 o'clock in the morning at the Miller Motors headquarters, the entire board of directors gathered to witness the official handover ceremony. Belinda stood at the head of the conference table with a triumphant expression as she placed the document containing my signature in front of the chairman. She joyfully declared herself the sole successor with full legal capacity, while glancing around the room to savor the submissive looks of the other board members. The atmosphere was thick with a sense of finality, until the heavy mahogany doors suddenly swung open to reveal an unexpected group of visitors. Clayton walked into the meeting room with a calm authority alongside Grandpa Grover, causing Dad and Belinda to freeze in shock at the sight of the people they despised the most. "What exactly is going on here, Clayton? Why do you think you have the right to interfere in a private meeting of my family?" Dad shouted while standing up from his chair in a fit of sudden rage. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as the presence of the company founder shifted the power dynamic within the room instantly. "I am here because I am the legal representative for the shareholder who owns 51% of this entire company, and that person is my wife, Heidi Miller," Clayton declared with a voice that echoed through the silent office. I walked into the room behind them while holding a digital tablet that was already connected to the main presentation screens of the headquarters. A new investigator named Julian, who served as my lead forensic accountant, stepped forward to present a fresh dossier to the stunned board of directors. Julian affirmed that the signature I had placed on the transfer paper a week ago was actually a legal request for an immediate financial fraud examination. The screens in the meeting room began displaying a detailed list of illicit transactions and forged invoices that Belinda had carefully executed over the last 3 years. We showed evidence of millions of dollars being diverted into private accounts that were directly linked to her personal luxury expenditures and failed gambling ventures. The board members watched in silence as the digital trail revealed how she had systematically hollowed out the company's core assets while claiming to be its savior. An emergency asset freezing order from the Supreme Court was served to Belinda and Dad right as the presentation reached its most devastating point. I watched as the arrogant smile on Belinda's face completely vanished, while she realized that her legal authority had been neutralized in a single moment. Dad sank back into his leather chair with a look of utter defeat as the realization of his daughter's criminal behavior finally broke through his stubborn pride. Grandpa Grover looked at his son with a mixture of pity and disappointment before turning his attention toward the board to demand a formal vote on the removal of the current management. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of years of deception and the sudden arrival of long overdue justice for the Miller legacy. Clayton provided each board member with a certified copy of our marriage license and the updated share registry that confirmed my majority ownership of the firm. He explained that my grandmother Eleanor's original will had specifically granted me the controlling interest upon proof of administrative corruption within the executive branch. We had spent months ensuring that every legal maneuver was backed by ironclad evidence that could not be challenged in any court of law. Belinda tried to speak, but her voice failed her as she stared at the screen, showing her own forged signature on a predatory loan agreement. I realized that the trap my grandfather and I had set was far more effective than we had even imagined during our secret meetings at the estate. The security team entered the room to ensure that no corporate documents or digital assets could be removed from the premises while the forensic audit was being finalized. Julian continued to explain the technical details of the fraud, while the board members began to distance themselves from Belinda to avoid being implicated in the scandal. I stood next to Clayton and felt a sense of peace, because the battle I had fought in the shadows was finally over. We had reclaimed the company not through greed, but through the same integrity that Grandpa Grover had used to build it from the ground up. The reign of Belinda was officially over, and the process of rebuilding the decaying legacy of Miller Motors was about to begin under a new and honest leadership. 12 o'clock noon arrived with a sudden wave of chaos as the Chicago Economic Police officially appeared in the grand lobby of the headquarters building. The heavy silence of the earlier board meeting was replaced by the firm commands of officers who were there to execute the warrants we had prepared. Belinda was handcuffed immediately in front of all the employees and business partners who had gathered to witness the dramatic fall of the Miller dynasty. She was being charged with multiple counts of grand larceny corporate fraud and the systematic forgery of executive management documents. I watched from the top of the marble staircase as the woman who had tried to destroy my life was forced to walk toward the exit in disgrace. Her face was pale with a mixture of terror and disbelief, while the flashing lights of the police cruisers reflected against the glass walls of the lobby. Dad collapsed onto the polished office floor when he finally realized that he had lost everything he worked for over the last 30 years. He looked like a broken man as the realization hit him that his favorite daughter had been deceiving him during the entire time he was protecting her. I walked toward the man who had once abandoned my interests and looked directly into his eyes without a single trace of sympathy or hesitation. The desperation in his gaze was a stark contrast to the cold arrogance he had displayed when he forced me to sign away my future in his private office. "Heidi, please find a way to help your sister, because she was only momentarily foolish, and we are still a family, after all," Dad begged while tears streamed down his aging face. I remained perfectly still as I listened to his hollow pleas for a loyalty that he had personally destroyed many months ago. "My family died on the very night you forced me to sign that paper to protect a criminal like her, instead of seeking the truth," I replied with a cold voice that silenced his sobbing. The pain I had carried for so long seemed to dissipate as I finally spoke the words that had been locked inside my heart since the betrayal. I signaled to the security team to execute the immediate expulsion order that would remove Milton from the premises without any further delay. He was informed that he had to leave the building immediately and was strictly prohibited from taking any valuable company assets or personal luxury items with him. The guards escorted him toward the side exit while he continued to look back at me as if he expected a last-minute miracle that would never arrive. Belinda began screaming my name in total desperation as the officers led her toward the waiting police vehicle parked at the main entrance. She struggled against the handcuffs while shouting accusations of betrayal at the crowd of onlookers who were recording the entire event on their mobile phones. I stood in silence and observed the complete collapse of a greedy individual who thought she was untouchable because of her family name. The employees who had once feared her began to whisper among themselves about the new era of transparency that was starting at Miller Motors. Clayton stood by my side and placed a supportive hand on my shoulder as we watched the sirens fade into the busy Chicago traffic. The corporate empire was finally free from the toxic influence that had been dragging it toward a permanent legal and financial ruin. Grandpa Grover joined us in the lobby and looked at the empty space where his son and granddaughter had stood just a few moments before. He reminded me that the price of integrity was often painful, but necessary for the survival of the values he had established decades ago. We knew that the process of repairing the company's reputation would take years of hard work and total dedication to the truth. I felt a profound sense of relief as I realized that I no longer had to hide my true intentions or live in fear of the next family betrayal. The midday sun was shining brightly through the atrium and illuminated the path toward a future where merit and honesty would finally be rewarded. I walked back toward the elevators with a clear mind and a steady heart, because the ghost of my past had finally been laid to rest. The legal team began the arduous task of securing the office files and changing the digital access codes to prevent any further tampering by Milton's remaining loyalists. Julian coordinated with the police to ensure that all the evidence we gathered was properly handed over for the upcoming criminal trial against Belinda. I spent the next hour meeting with the department heads to reassure them that their jobs were secure under the new administration. We discussed the immediate steps needed to stabilize our relationships with the vendors who had been alienated by Belinda's predatory business practices. The atmosphere in the headquarters began to shift from one of fear to one of cautious optimism as the truth became widely known. I knew that the battle was won, and the real work of building a legacy worth keeping was just beginning. At present, 6 months have passed since the day the old Miller empire collapsed, and I successfully restructured it into a completely new organization. I officially changed the name of the company to Miller Grover Legacy to honor the founding values that had been ignored for far too many years. With the professional help and unwavering support of Clayton, I transformed the business into the leading electric vehicle dealership chain across the entire Chicago region. We focused on sustainable technology and transparent customer service, while slowly rebuilding the trust of the partners who were once alienated by my sister's greed. The rebranding process was difficult but rewarding, as I watched the firm regain its status as a pillar of integrity within the local automotive industry. Every morning, I walk through the renovated lobby and feel a deep sense of accomplishment, knowing that the rot of the past has been thoroughly removed. Dad is currently living in a small and old apartment on the outskirts of the city, while surviving on a minimal monthly allowance that Grandpa Grover established for him. He no longer has access to the fleet of luxury cars or the social clubs that once defined his entire sense of self-worth and identity. I am told that he spends most of his days sitting on a park bench while staring at the skyline of the city he once thought he controlled with an iron fist. He occasionally tries to contact the office to ask for a meeting, but I have instructed my executive assistants to block all communication from him permanently. This total severance was a necessary step for me to begin a new life that is no longer haunted by the ghosts of manipulation and favoritism that surrounded my childhood. I realized that my father's downfall was not a result of my vengeance, but a direct consequence of his own refusal to value character over blind loyalty. Belinda is currently serving a long sentence in a state prison and constantly sends me long letters of apology from her cell. I have a growing stack of those envelopes sitting in a drawer at home, but I have never opened a single one of them because I know her words are motivated by desperation rather than true regret. She still hopes that I will use my influence and financial resources to hire a new legal team to appeal her criminal conviction for organized fraud. I prefer to leave her in the silence of the consequences she created for herself through years of calculated betrayal and theft. Every time a new letter arrives, I am reminded of the night she laughed while trying to strip me of my inheritance and my basic dignity as a human being. The woman who once thought she could manipulate the entire legal system is now just another number in a crowded and gray correctional facility. The success of Miller Grover Legacy has allowed me to establish several charitable foundations that support young entrepreneurs who lack the family connections to start their own businesses. Clayton and I spend our weekends planning for the future of the company while ensuring that our own relationship remains built on a foundation of mutual respect and honesty. We have managed to create a corporate culture where employees are rewarded for their hard work and ethical behavior instead of their ability to flatter the executive leadership. Grandpa Grover frequently visits the main office to share his wisdom with the new management team and expresses his pride in the way I have handled the transition. He reminds me that the most important part of any legacy is not the money or the buildings, but the reputation that survives long after we are gone. I have finally reached a point where I can look back at the pain of the past without feeling the sharp sting of anger or the heavy burden of resentment. The journey from being an outcast in my own family to becoming the leader of a thriving business empire has taught me the true meaning of resilience. I realized that the most perfect revenge is not found in hurting those who wronged me or seeking a public apology that would never be sincere. Instead, the ultimate victory is living a life that is as brilliant and successful as possible while ignoring the people who tried to dim my light. I stand on the balcony of my new office and watch the city lights while feeling a profound sense of peace that I never thought I would experience. The cycle of betrayal is broken, and the future of the Miller name is finally in hands that value the weight of the responsibility. The documents and legal files from the trial have been moved to a secure storage facility, where they will remain as a quiet testimony to the truth of what happened. I no longer feel the need to explain my decisions to the high society circles that once gossiped about my family's spectacular and public downfall. My focus is entirely on the expansion of our electric vehicle network and the preservation of the legacy that Grandpa Grover entrusted to me. The path forward is clear, and I am walking it with a steady heart alongside the people who actually stood by me when I had nothing. I closed the final chapter of the old Miller Empire 6 months ago, and I have never looked back with a single moment of regret.
Trước khi kết thúc câu chuyện đầy kịch tính ngày hôm nay, tôi muốn chúng ta dừng lại một chút để nhìn nhận sâu hơn về những gì đã xảy ra với gia đình Miller. Đừng vội bỏ qua chi tiết cuối cùng, bởi vì câu chuyện của Heidi không chỉ là sự trả thù mà là bài học đắt giá về lòng tham và sự công bằng. Tôi cho rằng một gia đình, sự thiên vị mù quáng của cha mẹ chính là liều thuốc độc hủy hoại đạo đức của đứa con được cưng chiều và tước đi cơ hội của đứa con thực tài. Sai lầm lớn nhất của Belinda là coi sự nhẫn nhịn của em gái là yếu đuối, trong khi thực chất đó là sự tích lũy của một trí tuệ sắc sảo. Bài học rút ra ở đây là tiền bạc và quyền lực có thể chiếm đoạt bằng thủ đoạn, nhưng sự tôn trọng và di sản bền vững chỉ thuộc về những con người có tâm đức và chính trực. Sự đoạn tuyệt của Heidi có thể tàn nhẫn, nhưng đó là cái kết cần thiết cho những kẻ chà đạp lên tình thân để chạy theo danh lợi ảo huyền. Cảm ơn các bạn rất nhiều vì đã lắng nghe câu chuyện đến giây phút cuối cùng này. Hãy để lại bình luận ở phía dưới để chúng ta thảo luận nhé. Đừng quên chia sẻ video nếu thấy bài học này ý nghĩa.